Stop whining. It's already sold. The words slammed into me, right here in my own kitchen. My 42-year-old son Mike, stood there with his arms crossed, his chin jutted out, completely unmoved by the devastation he just delivered. I needed that money. That money was my ticket to Italy, the trip Frank and I had planned for our 45th anniversary, the one we never got to take. His wife, Ashley, didn't even bother to look up from her phone at first. Then she glanced over, a little smirk playing on her lips. "Oh good," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness I'd come to know so well since the funeral. "She's being reasonable now." I stared at him, my hands still damp from the dishwater, Frank's favorite coffee mug trembling in my grip. "You sold your father's Rolex without asking me?" Mike just shrugged, a gesture of pure indifference that cut deeper than a knife. "Mom, seriously, get over it. It's just a watch. Just a watch. The only thing of Frank's I touched every single day. The watch I wound every morning, just like he'd taught me. The simple click 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 of the crown, a morning prayer that kept him close, just 6 short months after laying him to rest. The thing about betrayal is that it has a taste. It's bitter, metallic, like an old penny on your tongue." And standing there, looking at the two of them getting ready for their own trip to Italy, I tasted it fully for the very first time. I took a slow breath, held Ashley's condescending gaze, and asked quietly, "Which pawn shop?" They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't over. A mother doesn't just give up. Ashley, of course, had to chime in. "Honestly, Dorothy, clinging to material possessions isn't healthy. Frank wouldn't want you living in the past." "Don't tell me what Frank would want," I thought, biting back the words. She'd been telling me what Frank would want ever since we buried him, usually right before asking for something. "Golden State Pawn on Milwaukee Avenue," Mike said, checking his watch. "An expensive new Apple thing, the kind that probably cost more than he thought the Rolex was worth. They gave me $800. Not bad for something that old. $800. I felt the air leave my lungs. $800 for a 1978 Rolex Submariner. The watch Frank saved 3 months of overtime pay to buy, the year Mike was born. The watch he wore every single day of our 43-year marriage, except for the last one. The day the hospital handed it to me in a cold plastic bag along with his wedding ring. That watch was worth at least $3,000, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Ashley actually snorted. In what universe? It wasn't even running properly. My heart clenched. Of course it wasn't, because I was the one winding it. I was the one keeping it alive, keeping some small piece of Frank alive with me. But they wouldn't understand that, would they? Have you ever tried to explain the value of a memory to someone who only understands price tags? Mike and Ashley lived in a world of receipts and upgrades. A world where nothing was sacred and everything was for sale. "I'm going to get it back," I announced, my voice finding a strength I didn't know it had. "Good luck with that," Mike said, already heading for the door. "We fly out tomorrow morning. Ashley's been planning this for months." He said it like that was the only thing in the world that mattered. Ashley paused at the door, putting on that fake, sympathetic face she saved for special occasions. "Dorothy, you really should consider therapy. This obsession with Frank's things, it isn't normal." The door slammed shut, and the silence that had been my constant companion since Frank's passing rushed back in, colder than ever. But here's what my son and his lovely wife didn't know about their pathetic, grieving old mother. I spent 40 years as a bank manager. I knew the difference between giving up and strategic planning, and I was done giving up. The pawn shop was exactly what you'd expect. Cramped, dusty, with that sickly fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're coming down with the flu. The man behind the counter, his arms a roadmap of faded tattoos, had the weary expression of someone who had heard every sob story in the book. He looked up as I walked in, and his eyes held a flicker of recognition. "You hear about the Rolex?" he asked before I could even open my mouth. "How did you know?" "Your son called," he said with an apologetic shrug. "Warned me you might show up. Said you were having a hard time letting go." The man, his name tag read Danny, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Look, lady, I feel for you, I do. But business is business. I paid fair market value." Fair market value. As if you could put a price on 43 years of marriage. On the sound of Frank winding that watch every morning while the coffee brewed. on the heavy, final weight of it in my palm when the nurse gave it to me. "I'll buy it back," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever you need. I'll pay it." Danny shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. "It's already sold. Guy came in this morning, paid cash. No returns in this business." My heart didn't just sink. It plummeted. It was gone. Some stranger was walking around Chicago wearing my Frank's watch, all because my son needed spending money for his vacation. But as I stood there, letting the full weight of this final loss wash over me, Danny leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But here's the thing," he said, a little conspiratorially. "We found something weird when we were cleaning it up for sale." He disappeared into a back room for a moment, and when he returned, he was holding a small manila envelope. What he said next changed everything again. There was a hidden compartment in the back. A real professional job must have been done by a jeweler. "We found this inside." He slid the contents of the envelope onto the counter. It was a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. And on it, in Frank's careful, familiar handwriting, were 2 lines. The first read, "Dorothy's birthday, July 15, 1955. The day I knew I'd marry her." Below that, a series of numbers and letters that looked like some kind of code. SS 4457 CH0815DS. My hands were shaking as I stared at the paper. A hidden compartment? In all our years together, Frank had never mentioned a single word. A secret he'd worn on his wrist every single day. "You recognize those numbers?" Danny asked gently. I shook my head, but a little bell was ringing somewhere in the back of my mind. They felt familiar, like a password or an account number I'd seen long ago. Frank was meticulous about everything, especially numbers. "The man who bought the watch," I said, a new urgency in my voice. "What did he look like?" Danny's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Ma'am, I really can't." "Please." I leaned forward, letting him see the raw grief I'd been trying to hide. "That watch is all I have left of him. I'm not asking you to break any laws. I need to know if the buyer seemed to know about the compartment." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "He didn't say much," he admitted. "But when I mentioned we'd found something inside, he got real interested. Asked if we'd opened it." A chill went right down my spine. "Did he give you a name?" "Paid cash. No paperwork required for purchases." Danny paused. "But he did ask specifically about watches that had come in recently. Said he collected vintage Rolexes. Someone had been looking for Frank's watch. Specifically. But why? And how could they possibly know about a secret compartment that even I, his wife of 43 years, had no idea existed?" I thanked Danny, my mind reeling, and walked back to my car, the piece of paper in my purse feeling like a burning coal. Frank had kept this secret for nearly half a century. What else had my husband been hiding from me? That night, I sat at Frank's old oak desk, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago. I was surrounded by a lifetime of financial records. Frank kept everything, all filed away in his precise, methodical manner. The code from the watch stared up at me. SS 4457 CH0815DS. I'd gone through every account we owned. Our savings, our checking, the modest retirement fund. Nothing matched. Frank had always been so conservative with money, or so I thought. We lived a simple life. We clipped coupons. We drove sensible cars. The idea of him having some secret, hidden account seemed impossible. Just then my phone rang, shattering the quiet. Mike's name flashed on the screen. Part of me wanted to just let it ring. "Mom," he said, without any preamble. "Ashley's upset. She says you made a scene at the pawn shop." I almost laughed. A scene? Is that what they call a grieving widow trying to recover her husband's stolen property? "I went to buy back your father's watch," I said, my voice flat. "Unfortunately, someone else already purchased it." See? Problem solved. Time to move on. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. This was the boy Frank had taught to ride a bike, the man Frank had been so proud of on his college graduation day. When had he become so cold? When did his heart turn to stone? "Mike," I said, deciding to see what would happen. There was something hidden inside the watch. "Your father left me a message." Silence. For a full 10 seconds, There was nothing but dead air on the other end of the line. Then his voice came back different. Sharper. What kind of message? I'm not sure yet. It looks like account numbers, or maybe a password. Mom. His tone had changed completely. All that casual indifference was gone, replaced by a sudden intense alertness. What exactly did the message say? Something in his voice made me pause. Have you ever had that feeling? That gut instinct that tells you to hold something back, to keep your cards close to your chest? This was the most interested Mike had sounded in anything related to his father since we buried him. Just some numbers, I said vaguely. Probably nothing important. Maybe I should come over, he offered a little too quickly. Help you figure it out. This time I did laugh. It was a bitter, ugly sound. Yesterday you told me to stop living in the past. Today you want to help sort through your father's things. I'm just trying to be supportive, he said, a new edge of frustration in his voice. By stealing his watch? He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Fine, be stubborn. But don't come crying to me when you drive yourself crazy chasing ghosts. He hung up and I stared at the phone. His sudden interest wasn't just suspicious. It was a blaring red flag. He'd made it perfectly clear he thought Frank's possessions were nothing but worthless sentiment. Unless he knew they weren't. I turned back to the desk, but I looked at the code differently now. Frank was an accountant. He thought in systems, in patterns. Social Security? Frank's number was close but not a match. Chicago, maybe? That was our home. 0815. August 15th. Our wedding anniversary. Frank's initials were FS, mine were DS Dorothy Sullivan. My initials. The code had my initials at the end. It was a message for me. My fingers flew across the keyboard of my laptop. I started searching for things I never thought I'd search for. Swiss bank accounts. Offshore investment firms. 3 hours and 4 cups of bitter cold coffee later I found it. A discreet website for a firm called Secure Solutions Investment Management, based in the Cayman Islands. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth and secrecy. The login page required a client number. With a heart that was beating like a drum, I typed in the code. SS4457CH0815DS. A small green message appeared. Valid account number. Now the password. Something only I would know. Something Frank knew I would figure out. I tried our anniversary, my actual birthday, our first address. Nothing worked. Then I remembered the note. Dorothy's birthday, July 15, 1955. The day I knew I'd marry her. But my birthday is in April. July 15th, that was the day we met. At a summer dance in Millennium Park. He always said he knew that night. I can still feel the warm summer air. The sound of the big band playing. He was so handsome, so shy. With trembling fingers, I typed in the date. 071555. Access granted. The screen that loaded next made me gasp so loud the old house seemed to groan around me. There, at the top of the page in stark black and white, was the current account balance. $2,847,029.67. Frank, my frugal coupon clipping Frank, had hidden nearly $3 million from me. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Every argument we ever had about money, every time I bought the generic brand or patched Frank's work shirts to make them last another year. All of it played back in my mind like a cruel joke. My first feeling wasn't joy. It was anger. A white-hot rage at the years of deception. But then I clicked on the account history. The very first deposit was made in 1982, 3 years after Mike was born. $5,000. The notation read, Initial Inheritance Investment, FS. An inheritance? Frank's father had passed away the year before. I remembered the modest sum we'd received, just enough to pay off our small mortgage. Apparently there had been much more. For years the deposits were small. 500 here, 1,000 there. He hadn't been hiding our income. He'd been building something on the side, quietly, methodically. Then, around 2008, the numbers jumped. Deposits of $10,000, $20,000 at a time. The notation on those made my blood run cold. Real estate liquidation, Chicago properties. Frank had been buying and selling property, right here in our city, without my knowledge. How do you live with someone for 43 years and not know something so fundamental about them? I felt like I was married to a stranger. I found a folder in the account's message center labeled, "For Dorothy, emergency access only." Inside was a single video file, uploaded just 3 months before Frank died. My hand hesitated over the mouse. Was I ready to hear his explanation? Ready or not, I needed answers. Frank's face filled the screen. He looked older, more tired than I remembered him in his final days. He was sitting in his office at work, the camera angled slightly up at him. "Dorothy," he began, his voice steady but his eyes full of a deep sadness. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. And something's gone wrong." He took a deep breath. "I hoped you'd never need to see this, sweetheart. I hoped we'd grow old together, and I'd eventually tell you all about this over a glass of wine someday." He rubbed his face with that familiar gesture he always used when he was wrestling with a difficult problem. "The money, it isn't mine, Dorothy. Not really. It was my father's. He saw what the Great Depression did to good families. He made me promise to keep it secret, to protect it, to only use it if our family was ever in real danger." He went on to explain the investments, the legal protections, the careful way he'd grown the fund over 4 decades. But I was stuck on one phrase. Real danger. Frank died of a sudden heart attack at his desk. There were no warning signs. What catastrophe could he have possibly been protecting us against? Unless the danger wasn't random at all. The next morning, I called in sick to my part-time job at the library. For the first time in 6 months, I had a purpose that went beyond reshelving books. I started with Frank's last deposit, made just 2 weeks before he died. $25,000. The notation read, "Property sale, emergency liquidation." Emergency. He was converting assets to cash and he was doing it fast. I spent the day digging, researching every property transaction I could find under his name. The man I was married to wasn't just an accountant. He was a secret real estate mogul. But the thing that made my stomach clench was this. Every single property Frank had sold in the last year had been purchased by the same company, an LLC I'd never heard of. Sullivan Investments. Sullivan. My son's last name. My hands were shaking as I called my nephew Danny, the one who worked in real estate. "Aunt Dot, how are you holding up?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. "I'm fine, honey. Listen, I need your help. Have you ever heard of a company called Sullivan Investments LLC? Danny was quiet for a moment. "Actually, yeah," he said slowly. "They've been buying up a lot of properties lately. Cash deals moving fast." "Why? Can you find out who owns it?" "Sure. Give me an hour." That hour felt like a lifetime. I went back to Frank's desk, pulling open drawers I hadn't touched since he died. Tucked in the very back of his filing cabinet, behind 40 years of tax returns, was a folder labeled insurance policies. But there were no insurance documents inside. There were contracts, property deeds, and at the very bottom, a letter that made the world tilt on its axis. It was from a private investigator, dated 6 months before Frank's death. "Mr. Sullivan," it began. "Per your request, I have completed the investigation into your son, Michael Sullivan's financial activities. My findings are concerning. Your son has accumulated approximately $180,000 in gambling debts. He has also taken out multiple high-interest loans against his business using fraudulent information. Of greater concern are the inquiries Mr. Sullivan has been making regarding your estate. He has contacted 3 different lawyers asking about inheritance law and the process for contesting wills. He has also made inquiries about power of attorney procedures and elder care facilities. I believe your son is planning to have you declared incompetent in order to gain control of your assets." My phone rang and I jumped. It was my nephew. "Aunt Dot," he said, and his voice was grim. "You're not going to believe this. Sullivan Investments LLC. It's owned by Mike Sullivan. You're Mike." I closed my eyes, the pieces of this horrible puzzle clicking into place. Frank hadn't been hiding the money from me. He'd been hiding it from our son. The property sales, the emergency liquidations. Frank knew. He knew his own son was planning to rob us blind. And he had died before he could tell me, leaving only a tiny secret clue inside his watch. Mike hadn't stolen the Rolex for vacation money. He'd stolen it because he was hunting for the same thing I had just found. He was looking for the key to his father's hidden fortune. And now that he knew I'd found something, he wouldn't stop until he got it. I was still sitting there, staring at the investigator's report, when I heard a key in my front door. Ashley. She still had a spare, ostensibly to check on me. Now I knew she was just checking on her investment. Dorothy? Are you here? She called out, her voice that awful artificial sweet. Mike and I stopped by before heading to the airport. I quickly shoved the report back in its folder and minimized the bank account on my laptop. Whatever twisted game they were playing, I needed to understand the rules before I showed my hand. In the bedroom, I called back. They appeared in the doorway a moment later, Mike with his suitcase, Ashley dressed for a vacation that I had apparently paid for. Just wanted to say goodbye, Mike said, but his eyes weren't on me. They were scanning Frank's desk, taking inventory. What are you working on? Just sorting through your father's things, I said carefully. There's so much I never knew. Ashley drifted closer, her gaze locked on my laptop. Find anything interesting? She asked a little too casually. This wasn't a courtesy call. It was a reconnaissance mission. Just old bank statements, I said, keeping my voice even. Your father was very thorough. Mike seemed to relax a fraction. Yeah, Dad was obsessive about that stuff. Then I decided to test the waters. Actually, I said, watching them both closely, I did find something odd. Your father had some kind of investment account I didn't know about. Nothing major, just a few $1,000s. The change in both of them was electric. It was like a switch had been flipped. Mike stepped forward, trying to look casual and failing miserably. An investment account? What kind? I'm not sure yet. The paperwork is confusing. I might need to hire an accountant. Ashley exchanged a look with Mike. Oh, we could help you with that, she said, her voice smooth as silk. Mike's very good with financial documents. I bet he is, I thought, the private investigator's words about fraudulent loans echoing in my ears. That's very kind, I said. But I already made an appointment with Frank's old accounting firm. Mike's jaw tightened. Mom, those guys charge $300 an hour. I can look at it for free. I can afford $300 an hour, Mike. The silence in the room was thick with tension. Ashley's mask of concern was slipping, revealing the cold, calculating woman I now knew her to be. We should probably get going, she said finally, tugging on Mike's arm. But Mike didn't move. Mom, about that message you found in Dad's watch. Maybe I should just take a look at those numbers before we go. Just to make sure they're not important. What numbers? Ashley asked sharply. Mike shot her a warning look. Mom found some kind of code in the watch. Probably nothing. Now Ashley was fully alert, her vacation forgotten. What kind of code? I stood up slowly, drawing myself up to my full height. I looked down at my daughter-in-law, the woman who had sat beside me at my husband's funeral, probably already counting her inheritance. The kind, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. That is none of your business. Ashley's face flushed a blotchy red. Excuse me. You heard me. My husband left me a private message. Private being the important word here. Mom, Mike stepped between us, using that patronizing tone I had grown to despise. We're family. There's no need for secrets. Secrets? The irony was so thick I could taste it. You mean like secret gambling debts? Or a secret company you've been using to buy up properties with money you don't have? The color drained from Mike's face. Ashley's mouth fell open. I don't know what you're talking about, Mike stammered, but his voice was shaking. Sullivan Investments, LLC. Does that ring a bell? I watched their faces crumble. Your father knew, Mike. He knew everything. Ashley recovered first, her voice turning vicious. You crazy old woman. You don't know anything. Oh, I do, I said, walking to the desk and pulling out the investigator's report. I held it up for them to see. I know your husband owes $180,000 to people you don't want to meet. I know he's been researching how to have me declared incompetent. And I know you've been planning this for months. Mike slumped against the doorframe as if his strings had been cut. How? He whispered. Your father hired a private investigator. Every lie, every debt, every plan you made to steal from us. It's all documented. Frank protected me from you even after his death. That code you're so interested in? It's the key to more money than you have ever dreamed of. Money that will never ever be yours. We need to leave, Ashley hissed, grabbing Mike's arm. But Mike was just staring at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something that looked like respect in his eyes. He finally understood the man his father truly was. What kind of man does that make you, Mike? I asked, my voice softer now, filled with a mother's sorrow. To do this to your own family? For a brief second, he looked like the little boy I'd raised, lost and ashamed. Then Ashley's grip tightened, and the man he had become took over again. This isn't over, she spat as they turned to leave. Yes, I called after them, the word echoing in the suddenly empty house. It is. 2 days later, my doorbell rang at 8 in the morning. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a power suit and a younger man who looked like he'd stepped right out of a legal textbook. Mrs. Sullivan? The woman said when I opened the door. I'm Catherine Wells. We represent your son, Michael. Family legal matters, she called it. That was certainly one way of putting it. Your son is concerned about your well-being, she continued with a plastic smile. He's asked us to discuss some options. The younger man stepped forward with a tablet. We understand you may have discovered some complex financial accounts. Managing them can be overwhelming, especially during the grieving process. Overwhelming? I wanted to laugh. I'd managed our household down to the last penny for 40 years while my husband was secretly playing Monopoly with half of Chicago. I appreciate your concern, I said. But I'm perfectly capable. Of course, Catherine said, her smile never wavering. But your son could help. We've drafted documents that would give Michael power of attorney over your financial decisions. Just temporarily, of course. Until you've had time to properly grieve. There it was. Exactly what the investigator had warned me about. And who decides when my grieving period is over? I asked. Her voice sharpened just a little. Mrs. Sullivan, your son is prepared to file a petition with the court regarding your mental competency. He's concerned about some erratic financial decisions you've been making. What erratic decisions? Accessing offshore accounts, conducting international financial transactions without professional guidance. To an outside observer, it might appear you're not thinking clearly. The threat was clear. Sign it all away or be publicly declared senile. You know what's interesting about threats? I said, leaning against my doorframe. They only work if the person you're threatening doesn't have better lawyers than you do. Her professional mask slipped. I beg your pardon? I said, you can tell my son his plan won't work. Frank left me more than just money. He left me protection. I closed the door in their stunned faces and immediately called the number for Thomas Chan, the private investigator. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his voice calm and professional. I've been expecting your call. It turned out Frank hadn't just hired him to investigate. He'd hired him to prepare for war. In his sleek downtown office, Mr. Chan spread the documents across his desk. Bank records showing Mike's gambling losses. Photographs. And something that made my breath catch in my throat. Audio recordings? I asked, my voice trembling. Frank suspected Mike was planning something, Thomas explained gently. So he had your house wired for sound last year. It was his own property, completely legal. Every conversation. Every cruel joke about putting me in a nursing home. Every dismissive comment about my mental state. Frank had heard it all. And he'd recorded it. There was more. Evidence that Ashley had been running a whisper campaign, telling friends and family I was becoming senile, isolating me to lay the groundwork for their legal attack. But Frank had left something else. A sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was a letter, dated 1 week before his death. My dearest Dorothy, it began. If you're reading this, then Mike has shown his true colors. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about the account while I was alive, but I needed to protect it from him. But the money isn't just an inheritance, sweetheart. It's justice. When Mike started his real estate company, he'd brag about his inside deals. What he didn't know was that I was listening and investing in the same opportunities with money he didn't know existed. Every property he flipped, I bought 3 more in the same area. He unknowingly funded his own downfall. I used his own greed against him. Now it's your turn. The choice is yours, my love. You can forgive him or you can let him face the consequences. Forever yours, Frank. I looked up at Thomas Chan, the letter shaking in my hand. He watched me, his expression patient. "Mrs. Sullivan," he asked, "are you ready to proceed?" I thought of Mike as a little boy with scraped knees, and then I thought of him standing in my kitchen, his face a mask of contempt. Some bridges, once they are burned, can never be rebuilt. "Mr. Chun," I said, "I want you to file everything." The next morning, my quiet neighborhood street looked like a scene from a movie. 3 black SUVs were parked in front of Mike and Ashley's house, and men in FBI windbreakers were carrying out boxes. My phone rang. "Mom." Mike's voice was pure panic. "What did you do?" "I protected myself," I said calmly, watching as an agent loaded his computer into a truck. "Something you should have been doing for your own family. You don't understand. This will destroy us." "You destroyed yourselves, Mike. I just kept the receipts." Ashley grabbed the phone, her voice a shrill scream. "You vindictive old witch. By stealing my husband's watch?" I countered. "By planning to have me declared incompetent?" The line went quiet. "Frank knew everything, Mike. He recorded you. He knew about the gambling, the lies, the plans to put me in a home. He spent the last year of his life building a case against his own son. Dad wouldn't." His voice broke. "The FBI is seizing your records because Frank proved you were getting fraudulent loans. The IRS is auditing you for hiding income. And the state is investigating you for elder abuse. Mom, please." He sobbed. "I never meant for it to go this far." "When did it start, Mike?" I asked, a genuine question from a mother's broken heart. "When did you decide I was worth more to you gone than I was here?" There was a long silence, and then his voice was barely a whisper. "When I realized Dad had been hiding money from us. I saw some paperwork last Christmas. I thought if you both died, everything would come to me." The honesty was brutal, but it was cleaner than the months of lies. "You were wrong," I said. "Frank made sure I would be protected. From you." And then I hung up. Weeks later, I was in Thomas Chen's office signing the last of the paperwork when his secretary announced I had a visitor. A well-dressed man in his 60s walked in, holding a familiar blue velvet box. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said with a kind smile, "my name is Richard Torres. I'm the one who bought your husband's watch." He explained he was a retired federal marshal, hired by Frank 20 years ago. His job? To monitor the watch. If it ever showed up in a pawn shop, he was to be notified immediately. "Frank was a thorough man," Richard said, opening the box. "But he didn't hand me the watch. He turned it over and pressed a tiny, invisible button on the back. A second hidden compartment, smaller than the first, clicked open. Inside was a micro SD card. Frank recorded everything, Mrs. Sullivan," Richard said gently. "Audio, video, financial records. Everything needed to ensure Mike could never successfully challenge you." He put the card into a reader, and the screen filled with files, irrefutable proof of his son's long-planned betrayal. He also left this. He handed me one final envelope. Inside, Frank had detailed his final move. In the event Mike ever took legal action against my competency, all of Mike's assets, the company, the debts, the legal fees, would be immediately transferred to a trust in his name, with the sole beneficiary being the Chicago Children's Hospital. Frank had designed a trap where Mike would inherit his own destruction. The last thing in the envelope was a small unsealed note. In Frank's familiar script it read, "Dorothy, you were always stronger than you knew. I just made sure you'd have the tools to prove it. Love always, Frank." 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of that very hospital, watching them install a brass plaque that read, "The Frank Sullivan Memorial Wing." Mike's attempt to steal my future had instead funded a place of healing for thousands of children. He and Ashley were serving time in federal prison. Their lives were in ruins. Mine was just beginning. I bought a small house by the lake. I joined 3 book clubs. And I started to live for myself. One evening my doorbell rang. It was my granddaughter Melissa, Mike's daughter. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. "Grandma Dorothy," she said, her eyes so much like Mike's, but filled with a kindness he'd lost. "I heard about what they did. I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. We talked for hours. She told me she knew something was wrong, that Ashley had been telling everyone I was getting confused. She was angry and she was heartbroken. How can you not hate him? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. I thought about Frank's letter, about the choice he'd given me. Because hate would mean he still has power over me, I told her. I choose peace instead. Later that night, after she left with a promise to visit every week, I sat on my porch watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. Frank's watch was on my wrist, its familiar weight a comforting presence. He'd been gone for over a year, but in a way he was still right here, still taking care of me. I learned that the greatest love stories aren't always about passion and romance. Sometimes they're about protection, about someone loving you enough to fight the battles you don't even know you're facing. Some people spend their whole lives looking for that kind of love. I was lucky enough to wear it on my wrist for 43 years. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever had to make that hard choice, the one between family loyalty and your own peace? Remember, darling, no matter what storms you face, it's never too late to come home to yourself.